All right, let's go over example 2, which is comparing values. And this is part of chapter 6, section 4, absolute value. Problem A says to compare 2 and the absolute value of -5. Remember that these lines around -5 mean the absolute value. And absolute value means the distance from 0. So as we learned in the previous example, the absolute value of a number can never be negative, right? So because it's always how many steps or how far away a number is from 0. So it's never a negative number. So before we even graph anything, let's decide what is the absolute value of -5. Well, the absolute value of -5 would just be 5. So to graph, so we're going to graph 2, which is right here. And then we're going to graph the absolute value of -5, which is 5. So we're going to graph 5. So remember that this 5 is actually the absolute value of -5, which equals 5. Okay, so now let's compare 2 and the absolute value of -5. Okay, so 2, is that greater than or less than the absolute value of -5? Well, 2 is to the left of the absolute value of -5, so it's less than. Less than the absolute value of -5. Okay, let's look at another one. Compare absolute value of -4 and -2. Okay, so again, let's determine what the absolute value of -4 is. I know that the absolute value of -4 is 4. So we're going to go ahead and graph that. It's going to show you a line of where that came from. The absolute value of -4 is 4, so that's why it's graphed at 4. And then we're comparing it to -2. Okay, so is the absolute value of -4 greater than or less than -2? Well, absolute value of -4 is to the right of -2, so it's greater than. Okay, let's go over another one. Let's compare -5 and the absolute value of 5. All right, well, first let's decide what the absolute value of 5 is. How far away is 5 from 0? And I know that's 5. Okay, we also need to graph -5. So here's -5, and then the absolute value of 5 is 5. Okay. Now let's decide, is -5 greater than or less than absolute value of 5? Well, -5 is to the left of the absolute value of 5, so it's less than absolute value of 5. Okay, one more. Let's compare the absolute value of -1 and -1. All right, let's decide what is the absolute value of -1. I know -1 is 1 step away from 0, so the absolute value of -1 is 1. So let's graph that. Okay, and then we also need to graph -1. So we need to decide, is absolute value of -1 greater than or less than 1? Well, the absolute value of -1 is 1, and that's to the right of -1, so it's greater than -1. All right, one more example, and then we're done with this section.